Welcome back. My name is Frank Perri, and we will be discussing the methods of violence red-collar offenders rely on in order to eliminate the person that is going to detect the presence of their fraud schemes. Now, before I discuss the methods of violence, let's at least take a little bit of time to think about the types of fraud that predate the homicide, for example. In my research, some of the frauds that I've been able to disclose are credit card fraud, insurance fraud, mortgage fraud, and financial statement fraud. Now, what kind of violence are we talking about? It's planned violence. It is not a reactive violence. What do I mean? Well, let me give you an example of reactive violence. You may have individuals that are at a bar, people are drinking, somebody says something that is insulting to the other person, that person reacts to the provocation, pulls out a gun and shoots them. In many respects, it's like an emotional outburst where the violence is contemporaneous with the provocation. That's not what you have here. This is planned violence. What kind of weapons do they use? Well, in my research, it can either be that they're using their own hands, it can be that they're using a gun, for example, and also a hard object like a tool, a hammer, something that can crush bone that would result in blunt force trauma. Now, do they participate in any other type of methodologies? You bet. They also participate in murder for hire schemes. What is that? That's when the red collar offender is making a decision not to do the killing themselves, but to pay somebody else to do it for them. Now, why is that an attractive alternative? Well, because it sets up that perfect alibi in that if the person died in one place, one city, they can always say, listen, I didn't do this. I was in another state. I was in another city. My hands are clean. What kind of contract killer do they rely on? Well, let me classify them and make it simple for you. We'll look at the professional contract killer and the amateur contract killer. What is the distinction? On balance, the professional killer are the ones that will leave no evidence behind that is traceable to them or the person that hired them. With an amateur, these individuals tend to be people who are down on their luck, all right? They may be drug addicts, all right? They don't necessarily get paid a lot of money for what they're gonna do, and at times, just the promise of payment is enough for them to engage in homicide. What kind of evidence do they leave behind? Well, they may leave behind cell phone records, fingerprint evidence. There may be eyewitness testimony who actually saw them do it, DNA evidence, hair fiber evidence, shoe print evidence, tire track evidence. What gets a lot of them in trouble is the fact that they talk a lot. And what happens is that those third parties who hear what they're doing will go to the police. Then the police will back into the contract killer and then to the red collar offender. Now, I want to make it clear, the fact that somebody's an amateur contract killer doesn't mean that they're not successful in killing a person. It means that they're more apt to get caught. Let's now also look at some cases. But before I do that, something that's really ironic is that often the red collar criminal tries to hire a contract killer while they're in jail. And the person that they actually send out to try to help them find the contract killer is the attorney that's representing them while they're in jail. Let's look at Randy Nowak. Now, Randy Nowak was known as a person that was in construction, but yet nobody ever knew anything that he built. But yet his wealth was always on display in the millions of dollars in the luxury items that he had for everyone to see. But at the same time, he was under investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. He knew that the IRS was onto him of tax fraud. He tried to hire somebody to kill the IRS agent that was investigating him. Luckily, the person that he was speaking to was an undercover officer. Randy promised him $10,000 to kill the agent, and there was a bonus. Another $10,000 if he would blow up the IRS building that housed the documents that would have unveiled his fraud schemes. Let's move on now to Robert Burke. He killed an individual by the name of Donna Willard. Now, unfortunately, at time in these cases, the person that is a victim was also involved in the fraud scheme. What happens is law enforcement and prosecutors try to then use them to disclose the fraud scheme of the individual that they were working with. In this case, Robert had promised a street-level offender $1,000 and some drugs. Now, interesting with Donna, prior to her homicide, she actually feared for her life, and she said something to the effect that she thought that she was going to end up with 2 bullets in her head. In this case, what happened shortly after Donna said this? The street-level offender shot her twice in the head. Let us now move on to a predatory fraud offender by the name of James Bunchan. Now, James was of Cambodian descent, and he was married to an individual by the name of Sang Tan, who was also Cambodian. They were preying on a Cambodian community in Massachusetts, and they got the Cambodian community to help them participate in a Ponzi scheme. Now, at the time, these investors who were Cambodian didn't know that what they were investing in was not legitimate. Eventually, the wife, Sang Tan, and James were arrested for the Ponzi scheme. Sang Tan eventually was held accountable for the Ponzi scheme and the fraud that she committed. However, James had different ideas. While he was in prison, he was in fact trying to hire a contract killer to kill the Cambodians who were going to disclose the fraud that he had committed. And what he had planned was to have what I would characterize as a menu, a price list, ranging somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000, depending on how important somebody's death was to him. So one individual may be worth $19,000 dead, while the other individual would be worth maybe $11,000 dead. So this is another perfect example of that predatory fraud offender that we visualize, but that is willing to result in killing people to prevent the disclosure of their fraud schemes. Lastly, let's look at the case of Michael Burnett killing Valerie Vassell. This was another woman who was engaged as a co-conspirator in a bank fraud case with Michael, so they were working together. In this case, Michael had hired individuals to kill Valerie. And this is while he was in prison, of course, again, trying to hire somebody to kill Valerie. In this case, it was successful. While she was sitting down at dinner with her family, the contract killers came in and shot her at the table. Often we think that contract killing is reserved for organized crime, but it isn't. Contract killing can also be a tool that red-collar offenders rely on in order to achieve their goals. I thank you for listening to this segment. As always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and do stick around for our question and answer segment.
Frank, why do red-collar offenders prefer amateur contract killers?
You know, I think the amateur offender, the amateur contract killer to be specific, may be preferred for several reasons. I think first we need to be realistic that it is possible that the red-collar offender, the one that's actually doing the hiring, may simply not know where to go to find a professional killer. What do I mean? Well, for example, take organized crime. This is what they do. This is the part of their circle. So when somebody has to eliminate another person, it's very easy for them to find the person that's going to do the job. But you take a fraud offender who may not have any connection to organized crime and is simply trying to have somebody eliminated, simply may not know where to go. What's the next alternative? The amateur killer, all right? So it may be easier for them to find an amateur killer. And typically what gets the red-collar offender in trouble, even initially themselves, is that they talk. So what happens is they'll talk to friends and family, Then those friends and family will talk to other people, and that's how offenders get caught often. I think another reason why, though, that they may prefer, if necessary, if that's the proper way of characterizing it, the amateur killer is because perhaps they're cheaper. Even the promise to pay is enough. But also, I think they can control the amateur killer in the sense that telling them what to do and how to do the kill, when to do it, they have control. And because they want to have control over the person in the situation, these individuals may be easier to control. Let me give you an example. There was one red-collar offender who attempted to kill others. His name was, I believe, Pavel Valkovich. And what he did was he engaged in bank fraud, but then he wanted to have witnesses eliminated, so he tried to hire a contract killer who was amateur. He was telling them how to try to kill the person. Now, when that amateur killer didn't get the job done and Pavel was in custody, then he tried to hire another contract killer to kill the first contract killer and also the other people that he wanted to have killed initially. Not only those facts, but in terms of how to go about killing the person, what gun, how to dismember somebody. So you get all these dynamics that simply fall apart eventually. And thankfully, they do fall apart. Unfortunately, at times the amateur does complete their tasks, but at times they don't. And one of the reasons I think is because of the fact that the red-collar offender wants to exert a lot of control over the method of violence.
Do red-collar crime methodologies differ in other countries?
I would have to say that you do have red-collar crime in other countries, but it's very difficult to find cases, and you have to really dig hard to look for them. I would have to say that you do find some that do replicate the red-collar crime cases that I found that are within the United States. And I also found a few that were similar in methodologies to the ones in the United States in Scandinavian countries. What I found was that in certain, what I would refer to as perhaps former Soviet Union republics in Russia, they tend to make the kill public. They almost want to make a public display of killing somebody. Why? Because they're trying to send a message to others that if you start to interfere with our schemes, this is what's going to happen to you. So you do find some distinctions, and that they try to make a public show of it.
Why do you think red-collar criminals don't think about the obvious consequences of getting someone else involved?
To answer that question, I think we need to look at the psychological makeup of these individuals. In part, I think it has to do with their own narcissism, in that they believe that they are so good at what they do that they are incapable of getting caught. This, in criminological terms, is called a sense of immunity, also called super optimism, where you simply are not thinking of the consequences as others would think of them, simply because you think you're that good and you're not going to get caught. So there is a personality trait behind that. I would have to say that if they are psychopathic, at times people who are psychopathic appear to be more immune to that sense of punishment. Because they may be prisoners of the present, they may not necessarily reflect on how their behaviors play themselves out and the risks attached.
Thanks, Frank.